Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It is fitting that we situate ourselves in time before entering a place that has none. Tonight, we are tracing the shifting outlines of a city that does not exist. Carcosa, the spectral metropolis whose name drifts like smoke through the margins of literature, art, and madness. It is a word first whispered by Ambrose Bierce in 1886, then resurrected 9 years later by Robert W. Chambers in The King in Yellow, and later still by a generation of writers who sensed that this city, though fictional, carried the gravity of revelation. Carcosa is not a place one visits, but a place one remembers without having ever seen. It appears when language begins to decay, when meaning becomes feverish, when art crosses the line into contagion. We must recognize that what we are studying here is not merely a story world, but a philosophical artifact, a dream left behind by the 19th century's dying faith in beauty, reason, and reality itself. This investigation will move through history and myth, through etymology and obsession, to uncover how a name invented in fiction became a recurring presence in modern mysteries, from literature to television to online folklore. Yet every attempt to define Carcosa seems to feed the illusion that it defines us. Consider carefully. What kind of culture dreams so vividly of its own ruin? The search for Carcosa is not about discovery, but contagion, an inquiry that transforms the inquirer. And so, by listening, you have already stepped across its threshold. It begins, as all great hauntings do, with a disappearance. In 1914, Ambrose Bierce vanished into Mexico, leaving behind only speculation and a body of work obsessed with the porous border between life and death. Nearly 3 decades earlier, in 1886, he had published An Inhabitant of Carcosa, a brief, haunting tale of a man who wanders through desolate ruins, slowly realizing that he is dead and walking the remnants of his own city. According to early commentators, Bierce's story was not simply a ghost story, but an allegorical meditation on temporality, decay, and the disorientation of consciousness. It arose from a post-Civil War America still wrestling with mass death, fractured memory, and the illusion of permanence. Bierce's Carcosa is not a geographical location, but an existential condition, a landscape of loss where time itself seems to have died. In this sense, his narrative anticipates the modernist crisis of meaning, long before Eliot or Joyce articulated it. The story's economy of detail, its refusal to explain, renders the city more powerful than any fully described inferno. We must recognize that Bierce did not invent a mythology, but an absence, a hole in language where myth might one day grow. It is from this void that Robert W. Chambers would later draw, turning Bierce's philosophical ruin into a contagious nightmare. Chambers, born in 1865, was trained as a painter at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where he absorbed the aesthetic currents of the fin de siècle, the languor of decadence, the shimmer of symbolism, and the creeping sense that art itself had become a kind of terminal disease. When he published The King in Yellow in 1895, he framed his interconnected stories around a fictional play said to drive readers mad. Within this work, the name Carcosa re-emerged, no longer as a distant allegory, but as a symbol of aesthetic contagion, an idea that infects both mind and world. Scholars have often noted that Chambers's creative intent was ambiguous. He was neither occultist nor satirist, neither realist nor dreamer. Yet this ambiguity is central to the power of Carcosa. It is not doctrine, but suggestion, not theology, but tone. Chambers's Carcosa is not merely an homage to Bierce's ruined city, but its spectral reflection, translated through decadent sensibility into something exquisite and diseased. What Bierce mourned, Chambers adorned, and in doing so, he ensured that the city would survive precisely by decaying further. The cultural moment of the 1890s shaped this transformation profoundly. It was a decade of spiritual exhaustion in Europe and America alike, a twilight of faith where science and mysticism uneasily coexisted. Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, and ceremonial magic were resurgent, promising access to hidden worlds through arcane study. Simultaneously, symbolist writers such as Mallarmé and Huysmans spoke of art as the only remaining path to transcendence, though one steeped in decadence and despair. Chambers's Carcosa emerges at this intersection, a metaphysical ruin painted with aesthetic brushstrokes, a city whose existence depends on perception rather than geography. It is not a new Eden, but a museum of divine decay. The Yellow King who reigns there is not a god, but an emblem of entropy. Beauty turned to corruption, illumination to infection. Consider this carefully. Carcosa's lure is that it presents annihilation as art. By transforming Bierce's existential desolation into aesthetic madness, Chambers reflected the fin de siècle's own crisis, the suspicion that art, once a path to truth, had become a mask for nothingness. It is not simply that Chambers expanded Bierce's myth. He inverted its moral geometry. Bierce's ghost awakens to revelation. Chambers' artists awaken to delirium. In The Repairer of Reputations and The Yellow Sign, the play The King in Yellow acts as an epistemic contagion, erasing the boundary between symbol and world. The creator becomes victim of creation. The viewer becomes prisoner of vision. Such transformations echo the wider artistic anxieties of the period. The late Victorian artist feared that representation itself, painting, poetry, performance, could no longer mediate reality, but only distort it. Like Dorian Gray's portrait or Wilde's own public scandal, art began to consume its maker. Carcosa becomes, therefore, the ultimate artistic metaphor, a work of fiction that infects the real through belief. We must pause here, for this inversion marks a decisive turn in literary history. The haunted castle, or cursed relic, gives way to the haunted text, the cursed idea. Bierce's moral allegory thus becomes Chambers' epistemological abyss. The precise geography of Carcosa, with its twin suns and Lake of Holly, suggests a cosmology rather than a setting. This reflects Chambers' background in visual art. He paints the world not through narrative causality, but through compositional arrangement. The city's decaying towers and luminous skies form an aesthetic tableau of entropy, as if civilization itself were dissolving under the pressure of perception. Critics have often compared this imagery to the paintings of Böcklin and the symbolist landscapes of Redon, both of whom depicted dreamlike ruins suffused with melancholy light. Such imagery was no accident. Chambers wrote during an era when color itself carried moral weight. The yellow of sickness and decay, the pallor of spiritual corrosion. Thus, Carcosa is not a city, but a palette, not an architecture, but an atmosphere. It is not built, it is painted, written, remembered. And through this act of artistic creation, Chambers blurred the line between representation and revelation. The artist no longer mirrors reality. He manufactures it only to be devoured by it. Philosophically, the birth of Carcosa encapsulates the transition from moral realism to metaphysical horror. Bierce sought to reveal that human pride ends in dust. Chambers revealed that dust itself might still dream. In both cases, the city becomes an externalization of consciousness, a psychic geography projected onto the void. Yet Chambers' intent was less to moralize than to unsettle. His contemporaries, including Wilde and Beardsley, flirted with the idea that beauty itself was immoral precisely because it refused to serve truth. Carcosa emerges from this aesthetic nihilism as its most enduring emblem, the city as hallucination, art as infection, beauty as disease. It is not the horror of monsters, but of meaning itself. To read Chambers is to glimpse the threshold where imagination devours ontology, where symbol becomes sovereign. The implication is unsettling, that human creativity, untethered from belief, collapses into self-replicating delirium. Thus, the historical and creative intentions behind Carcosa's invention reveal not merely a literary progression, but a cultural confession. Bierce's Carcosa mourned mortality. Chambers' Carcosa celebrated dissolution. Together, they articulate the 19th century's dying faith in reason, its retreat into dream and symbol. This is why Carcosa continues to resonate. It is the perfect emblem of modernity's self-awareness, the realization that knowledge, art, and consciousness may all be forms of madness wearing different masks. The city is at once a relic and a prophecy, a ruin that keeps rebuilding itself in our collective imagination. And as we move next into the cultural and philosophical antecedents of this idea, we will see that Carcosa's roots stretch far deeper than Bierce or Chambers suspected. Touching the very foundations of Western thought and the shadowed tradition of civilizations that dream themselves into decay. To understand why Carcosa endures, we must first understand what it inherits. No myth arises in isolation. Every phantom city is built upon the ruins of older architectures, philosophical, theological, and aesthetic. Carcosa's foundations lie not merely in the imaginations of Bierce or Chambers, but in the longer Western dialogue about illusion, decay, and divine absence. In the Platonic sense, Carcosa could be seen as a fallen echo of the ideal city, a distorted reflection of transcendent order glimpsed through corrupted perception. According to Plato, the world of appearances is but a shadow of perfect forms. Yet, Carcosa reverses this equation, suggesting that the shadow has become self-aware, generating its own false eternity. It is not the reflection of truth, but the imitation of imitation, a counterfeit cosmos built on recursive memory. Consider carefully what that means. A civilization existing only because it remembers itself existing. Such an idea foreshadows not only Chambers' dream logic, but modern notions of simulated reality and narrative recursion. Through this inversion, Carcosa transforms metaphysical philosophy into metaphysical horror, where the pursuit of truth reveals that truth itself is the most persistent illusion. Historically, the late 19th century provided fertile ground for such pessimism. The optimism of Enlightenment rationalism had eroded under the pressures of industrial modernity, evolutionary science, and the slow death of faith. Philosophers like Schopenhauer and von Hartmann articulated a universe devoid of benevolent purpose, describing life as a cycle of blind striving and inevitable decay. Carcosa thus becomes an aesthetic reflection of this worldview, a city eternally collapsing into itself, illuminated by twin suns that symbolize knowledge and madness. It is not a heaven fallen, but a hell aestheticized. The notion that consciousness is both the source and the victim of suffering finds its mirror here, where awareness does not liberate but condemns. In this sense, Carcosa is a psychological artifact of a culture realizing its insignificance in a mechanistic cosmos. Bierce's soldier wandering through ruins and Chambers' artists falling into dream both echo this same revelation. Humanity, seeking transcendence, finds only its own reflection in the void. Yet the philosophical lineage of Carcosa stretches even further, touching the esoteric and mystical traditions that haunted Western thought since antiquity. Gnostic cosmology, for instance, offers a striking parallel. The belief that creation is a flawed imitation of a C's divine original produced by an ignorant or malevolent demiurge. The Yellow King may thus be read as a decadent echo of this figure, a god who rules over imperfection, whose majesty consists in corruption. The twin suns of Carcosa recall the Gnostic division between the false light of the material world and the hidden illumination of divine truth. But where the Gnostics sought escape through revelation, Chambers' world offers no exit. Revelation itself becomes the trap. It is not enlightenment, but infection, not salvation, but repetition. Here, the philosophical becomes pathological. The quest for knowledge transforms into a symptom, and Carcosa becomes the mind's own fever dream, the place where every seeker eventually drowns in the mirror of understanding. Equally significant is the influence of Romanticism and its decay into decadence. The Romantic imagination, from Shelley to Coleridge, often sought transcendence through sublime confrontation with the infinite. Mountains, storms, and ruins served as mirrors for the human soul, yearning toward the ineffable. By the 1890s, however, this yearning had soured. The sublime had curdled into aesthetic despair. What once signified awe now signified exhaustion. Chambers' generation inherited the Romantic vision, but stripped it of hope, producing what scholars call the aesthetics of exhaustion. Carcosa thus occupies the same conceptual terrain as Baudelaire's Peri, or Ouémon's des Esseintes, a world of artificial beauty masking spiritual decay. The city's yellow light is not illumination, but overexposure, revealing too much until all meaning bleaches out. It is not the romantic ruin that inspires melancholy reflection, but the decadent ruin that luxuriates in its own corruption. In Carcosa, even decay becomes ornamental. This is not the fall from grace. It is the aestheticization of the fall itself. We must recognize, too, the Eastern currents that entered Western thought at precisely this time. Theosophy, Orientalist philosophy, and the popularization of Buddhist and Hindu cosmologies brought new conceptions of cyclic time and illusion into the Western intellectual bloodstream. The Buddhist notion of samsara, existence as endless recurrence of birth and decay, finds a distorted echo in Carcosa's eternal recurrence. Its twin suns never set, its black stars never rise. The cycle is frozen, neither life nor death, but repetition without renewal. In this sense, Carcosa can be seen as a Western nightmare of Eastern metaphysics, the terror that enlightenment might mean dissolution, that the self might vanish entirely. Theosophical thinkers like Helena Blavatsky imagined astral planes and hidden masters, but Chambers offers only the aesthetic residue of such dreams. A plane devoid of masters, haunted instead by art's own spectral consciousness. The result is neither mysticism nor materialism, but a kind of aesthetic nihilism, a universe that exists only to witness itself fading. One might also consider the architectural metaphor at play. The 18th and 19th century fascination with ruins, exemplified in Piranesi's imaginary prisons and the neo-Gothic revival, shaped the Western imagination of decay as beauty. Carcosa inherits this visual grammar, yet perverts it. In Piranesi, ruins evoke the grandeur of lost civilizations. In Carcosa, they evoke the impossibility of civilization itself. The city's towers lean not because they have aged, but because time itself is diseased. Scholars have compared this imagery to the symbolist painting of Gustave Moreau, where mythological splendor becomes suffocating. It is not nostalgia for the past, but horror at the endlessness of artifice. The bridge between ruin and revelation collapses entirely, leaving only the aesthetic experience of collapse. Here again, the philosophical implication is profound. The human drive to memorialize meaning inevitably produces its own entropy. To name the eternal is to imprison it, and every monument is already a mausoleum. Ultimately, Carcosa synthesizes these diverse currents: Platonic shadow, Gnostic despair, romantic exhaustion, and decadent artifice, into a single haunting metaphor for civilization's self-awareness. It is not simply a setting, but a philosophy, the recognition that consciousness is both architect and inmate of its own prison. The city's very name, possibly derived from carcer, Latin for prison, encodes this truth. Carcosa is the cell where thought contemplates its own decay, and yet, paradoxically, this recognition becomes a kind of beauty. In acknowledging corruption, art achieves a strange lucidity, a mirror-like calm in which even annihilation acquires grace. The philosophical antecedents of Carcosa thus prepare us for its linguistic and symbolic complexity, how a single invented name could contain so vast a network of associations. As we turn next to the etymology and symbolic language that sustain its aura, we will see that Carcosa's power lies not in what it describes, but in what its very sound suggests: the rhythm of confinement, the echo of ruins speaking to themselves across centuries. The power of Carcosa begins not with plot or character, but with sound. Its resonance lingers because its name does not explain, it suggests. Etymologically, Carcosa is an invented word, yet one that vibrates with latent meanings. Scholars have speculated that Bierce, who first used it in 1886, may have drawn it from the Latin carcer, prison, embedding within it the idea of confinement, entrapment, or cosmic incarceration. Others detect echoes of carcass, a linguistic cadaver evoking rot and forgotten remains. But the genius of the word lies not in its origin, but in its ambiguity. Like so many mythic place names, Atlantis, Relaye, Hyperborea, Carcosa performs meaning rather than defining it. It is not simply a name, it is a tone, and that tone is decay. Consider this carefully. A word does not need a referent to possess power. It only needs to behave as if it once did, evoking the ghost of forgotten knowledge. Carcosa is that ghost. It speaks not of something lost, but something that was never known, an imaginary past with the gravity of real memory. The symbolic language surrounding Carcosa deepens this illusion. Chambers did not merely name a place, he encoded it within a constellation of symbols: the Yellow King, the Lake of Hali, the Black Star, and the Twin Suns. These symbols do not cohere into a mythology in the conventional sense. Rather, they behave like fragments from a text that has been mostly erased. Their power lies in their incompleteness. Take, for instance, the yellow sign. It appears in Chambers' stories as a marker of doom, yet its visual form is never described. Later writers and artists, including the creators of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, attempted to fix its shape, a coiling spiral, a broken glyph, but these concretizations inevitably diminish the sign's original ambiguity. The yellow sign works because it resists interpretation. It is not a symbol of something. It is the infection of symbol itself. Like Carcosa, it corrupts not by being understood, but by insisting it once meant something you should already know. Color, too, becomes a symbolic vector for decay. Yellow, far from representing sunshine or warmth, is here the color of sickness, treachery, and madness. In the 1890s, the color was already undergoing semantic transformation in popular culture. Yellow journalism, yellow wallpaper, and yellow fever all contributed to its association with instability, deceit, and breakdown. In The King in Yellow, Chambers weaponizes this palette. The color becomes a kind of epistemological corrosion, a shade that bleaches the boundary between reality and imagination. It is not the color of knowledge, but of overexposure. The sun, when doubled, does not illuminate. It burns. The page, when saturated, does not reveal. It erases. Thus, yellow becomes not simply a motif, but a mode of infection, a chromatic symptom of an idea that cannot be contained. This reveals something profound. In Carcosa, symbolism does not serve meaning. It replaces it. Symbols become symptoms. The dual suns and the black star form a cosmological grammar around Carcosa, terms that suggest a system of celestial significance without offering any functional astronomy. The twin suns are often interpreted as paradoxical, one illuminating life, the other death, one real, the other imagined, or both existing in a universe where contradiction is the only law. The black star, by contrast, signals collapse, a gravitational symbol, perhaps, for a truth so dense it annihilates meaning around it. Taken together, these symbols reflect a worldview where reality is layered, broken, and recursive. Chambers gives us not a mythos with rules, but a mythology of suggestion, a cosmology that refuses to stabilize. This again is central to Carcosa's linguistic power. The city does not exist on a map. It exists in the tension between words, the pressure between metaphor and madness. It is not a place of coordinates, but of correspondence. Masks feature prominently in the Carcosan semiotic structure, objects that conceal but also transform. In The Mask and the Yellow Sign, identity itself is mutable, refracted through artistry and hallucination. The mask is not merely a disguise, it is a replacement for the self. This trope echoes ancient ritual use, where masks did not hide but become the divine. In Carcosa, however, the divine is diseased. The mask does not elevate, it absorbs. Wearing it does not conceal the truth, it obliterates the wearer. Here we find a striking parallel to the Lacanian mirror stage, wherein the self is formed not by interior coherence, but by exterior reflection. Carcosa, like the mirror, offers an image that is seductive and false. The symbolic language of masks, signs, suns, and stars form not a coherent system, but a trap for interpretation. Every attempt to decode merely deepens the reader's entanglement in the symbolic maze. This is not accidental, it is design. We must recognize that Carcosa's power lies in linguistic recursion, a technique by which fiction simulates reality through internal echo. Chambers quotes the fictional play, The King in Yellow, inside stories about its effects. He names places, gods, and signs without origin or context. This simulation of depth creates what some literary theorists call false intertextuality, the appearance of a larger, older mythological network that does not exist, yet behaves as if it does. The city of Carcosa gains plausibility not through description, but through reference. It is named often and defined never. Its symbolism suggests pattern, but never produces clarity. It is, in effect, a mythogram, a cluster of floating signifiers whose only stability is the aesthetic gravity they exert on the reader's imagination. Not X, not Y, but Z. Not myth, not metaphor, but a mirror in which our desire for structure creates illusion. The more we look, the more Carcosa becomes real. Ultimately, The symbolic language of Carcosa demonstrates the principle that ambiguity, when ritualized, becomes revelation. The name, the colors, the signs, the astronomical motifs all operate at the edge of sense, crafting a mythology that functions not through exposition, but contagion. Carcosa is spoken into being by repetition, by the hunger for meaning in the face of silence. And this linguistic hunger is precisely what makes the city so enduring. Its language is not descriptive, but infectious. Its symbols do not reveal, they replicate. As we move next to examine how Chambers constructed the illusion of mythic authenticity through his narrative strategies, we will see how language itself becomes the architecture of belief, and how fiction, in Carcosa, is indistinguishable from revelation. The enduring potency of Carcosa lies not merely in its aesthetic or linguistic mystique, but in its simulated mythic depth, its ability to appear older, deeper, and more coherent than it is. Robert W. Chambers, in his 1895 collection, The King in Yellow, pioneered a narrative method that we might term mythopoeic illusionism, the construction of an internally consistent yet fundamentally fictional mythos through the strategic use of narrative fragmentation, pseudo-scholarship, and self-referential recursion. He did not present Carcosa, Hastur, or the Yellow Sign as creations, but as artifacts, echoes from some prior literature or distant tradition the reader had somehow missed. This illusion of pre-existence is what gives Carcosa its unique gravitational pull. Unlike traditional fantasy mythologies, which explain and describe their worlds, Chambers allowed Carcosa to remain unresolved. It is not myth as system, but myth as mirage. And yet, paradoxically, that very vagueness produces authenticity. Consider carefully. Belief thrives not in clarity, but in the gaps between symbols where imagination is forced to intervene. Central to this technique is Chambers' use of the fictional play The King in Yellow, referenced but never fully revealed. Each story in the collection hints at different fragments, varying in tone and implication, yet always described as a text that induces madness in its readers. By embedding these citations within otherwise realist or decadent narratives, Chambers creates the impression that the King in Yellow is both central and inaccessible, an intertext whose absence defines the structure of meaning. Literary theorists have likened this strategy to a narrative black hole, a missing core that generates orbiting fragments, each pulled inward by suggestion, but never touching the central void. This missing play, and the cryptic verses that survive from it, strange is the night where black stars rise, function as sacred scripture for a religion that no one admits to believing. In this way, Chambers mimics the textual archaeology of real mythic traditions. He does not write mythology. He writes around it, creating the illusion of discovery rather than authorship. We must recognize the influence of Victorian and fin de siècle occult scholarship here. The late 19th century saw a proliferation of revealed texts, the Book of the Law, the Secret Doctrine, the Kybalion, which claimed ancient origins while being modern compositions. Chambers tapped into this epistemic environment, crafting his own pseudo-arcana with uncanny precision. His invented names, Carcosa, Hali, Hastur, echo the phonetic patterns of ancient languages, combining hard consonants with liquid vowels to suggest antiquity and sacred mystery. These names operate as mythic placeholders, implying cosmologies without detailing them. More significantly, Chambers never clarifies their relationships. Is Hali a lake, a planet, a state of mind? Is Hastur a place, a god, or a symbol? The refusal to resolve these ambiguities forces the reader into a mythographic posture, assembling theories from fragments, filling absences with associative meaning. In this sense, Carcosa does not exist on the page. It exists in the interpretive behavior it induces. Chambers also borrowed from the mise en abîme structure, embedding stories within stories and referencing books within books to create the illusion of a self-generating mythology. This recursive framing technique suggests textual layers, as though Chambers were merely the latest transmitter of a tradition, stretching backward into literary prehistory. It is not unlike Lovecraft's later approach with the Necronomicon, yet Chambers did it first, and arguably with greater subtlety. Consider The Repairer of Reputations. a story set in a future America told by an unreliable narrator who references the forbidden play, the yellow sign, and a suicide chamber sanctioned by the government. The absurdity of these elements is tempered by the consistency of their recurrence, the dry documentary tone, and the refusal to fully explain. This layering of implausible elements over an otherwise plausible world mirrors how real mythologies function. They are not coherent narratives, but accretions of ritual, symbol, and echo. Carcosa, in this regard, is not just a setting. It is an epistemological condition, a way of reading the world. The geography of Carcosa further contributes to its mythic authenticity. Though vague, it is populated by names that suggest depth: the Lake of Haley, the Haiads, Aldebaran. These celestial references are not entirely fictional. Aldebaran is a real star, and the Haiads are a genuine cluster. By anchoring the mythos to known astronomical bodies, Chambers blurs the boundary between fiction and fact, pulling the reader into a liminal zone of quasi-recognition. This is not a unique strategy. Virgil's Aeneid and Dante's Inferno both situate mythic journeys within recognizable geographies. But Chambers reverses the logic. Rather than grounding the myth in the real to make it believable, he infiltrates the real with the mythic to make it unstable. The stars themselves become infected with fiction. This is the opposite of world building. It is world unraveling. Importantly, Carcosa's indeterminacy made it fertile ground for literary continuation. Lovecraft's brief nods to Hastur and the yellow sign, as in The Whisperer in Darkness, suggest a tacit acknowledgement of Chambers' influence. Yet Lovecraft, ever systematizing, never fully incorporated Carcosa into his own mythos, leaving it suspended in ambiguity. Later writers, such as August Derleth, attempted to categorize the Yellow King as one of the Great Old Ones, assigning elemental attributes and hierarchies. But these efforts largely miss the point. Carcosa's power lies in its refusal to be systematized. Every attempt to define it degrades its mystique. It is not an origin point in a pantheon. It is a symptom of narrative itself breaking down. This reveals something profound about myth-making in modernity, that myths no longer arise from communal ritual, but from individual obsession, recursive texts, and the uncanny echo chamber of literary culture. In the end, Carcosa's authenticity is a performance, a ritual of suggestion, citation, and incompleteness that mimics the accumulated layers of real myth. It does not need a canon because it functions as a contagion. Like a virus, it spreads through fragments, references, and replications. Each new mention strengthens the illusion that Carcosa has always existed. And as we move next into the philosophical concepts that define its internal logic, insignificance, entropy, and dream reality, we will see how this false mythology becomes something far more dangerous. A metaphysical model for how meaning decays, how reality dreams itself, and how narrative itself might be the most ancient prison of all. At the core of Carcosa's enduring power lies not a single narrative, but a set of interlocking philosophical ideas: insignificance, entropy, and the instability of reality. These themes are not incidental. They form the gravitational field around which the entire mythos orbits. What makes Carcosa so haunting is its ability to dramatize philosophical despair without offering catharsis or clarity. It is not simply a city, not merely a symbol. It is a condition of thought, a lens through which existence is revealed as arbitrary, decaying, and unreal. The more one contemplates Carcosa, the more its boundaries dissolve, until what remains is the terrifying realization that the world we inhabit may be no more real, no more stable, than the dream architecture of the Yellow King's domain. Consider carefully what this implies, that Carcosa is not elsewhere. It is here. It is the name we give to the suspicion that everything has already begun to rot. Perhaps the most foundational idea in Carcosa's philosophical architecture is that of ontological insignificance. This is not merely the smallness of humanity in a vast cosmos, a common trope in cosmic horror, but the deeper suspicion that meaning itself is not guaranteed. In The Repairer of Reputations, Hildred Castaigne insists that he is heir to a cosmic monarchy, a delusion or revelation fueled by his reading of The King in Yellow. But the ambiguity of the story, set in a mildly dystopian future that may be real or hallucinatory, forces the reader to question not only Castaigne's sanity, but the coherence of the world around him. The text provides no objective reference point. It becomes impossible to say what is true and what is not. This epistemological uncertainty mirrors existential insignificance, the loss not of control, but of orientation. The self, adrift in a Carcosan reality, finds that even madness is no longer a deviation, but the norm. Related to this is the idea of entropy, the gradual and inevitable decay of systems, structures, and meaning itself. Entropy is not merely a scientific concept in Carcosa, it is an aesthetic one. The city's imagery, ruins under alien suns, crumbling towers beside a silent lake, conveys a sense of time having failed. Nothing progresses, nothing renews. The world is not ending with apocalypse, but with repetition. Chambers never offers a climactic revelation or a final collapse. Instead, he shows characters trapped in recursive decay. In The Yellow Sign, the painter's fascination with the sign grows not toward enlightenment, but toward erasure, as his identity is slowly overwritten by forces he cannot name. This is not the triumph of the void. It is the diffusion of self, the blurring of perception, the slow fading of all distinction. Entropy in Carcosa is not destruction, but dissolution. It is not chaos, but too much order, too much sameness, until the world and the dream are indistinguishable. This leads directly to the third and most destabilizing concept, dream reality. In Carcosa, reality is not a fixed substrate but a hallucination with the illusion of permanence. The characters who encounter the Yellow King do not merely go mad, they awaken into a different ontology. Reality, it turns out, was the delusion all along. In the fictional fragment from The King in Yellow, Camilla, you, sir, should unmask. Stranger, indeed. Casilda, indeed it's time. We all have laid aside disguise, but you. We see this idea encoded as theater. The world is a performance, a masked ball, and the act of removing the mask does not reveal the self, but reveals that there is no self to reveal. This reversal recalls the philosophical pessimism of thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer, who argued that individual will is a delusion and that consciousness is a curse. In Carcosa, the moment of unmasking does not lead to knowledge. It leads to evaporation. And it is precisely this that makes the unmasking irresistible. These three ideas, insignificance, entropy, dream reality, interact in Carcosa to create what might be called a metaphysical trap. The more one learns, the less one knows. The deeper the understanding, the more fragile reality becomes. In this way, Carcosa mirrors the function of a philosophical koan. It is not meant to be solved, but to unseat the mind. The more one engages with its symbols, stories, and signs, the more they dissolve into recursive contradiction. This is not narrative in the traditional sense. It is an epistemological mechanism designed to simulate the experience of metaphysical collapse. The reader, like the character, cannot escape the gravitational pull of the city. And this reveals something profound. Carcosa is not merely a setting for horror. It is horror transformed into structure, into condition, into grammar. One does not travel to Carcosa. One is translated by it. We might compare this to other literary manifestations of unreality and metaphysical dread. Borges's Tlön Ukabar Orbis Tertius constructs a fictional encyclopedia that gradually overwrites the real world, while Kafka's The Trial offers a bureaucracy so impenetrable that it becomes ontological. Carcosa sits beside these texts as a kind of metaphysical infection, an idea that rewrites the logic of reality rather than merely violating it. Unlike traditional horror, where fear stems from threat or violence, Carcosa's horror stems from recognition. It is the dawning realization that your memories may be scripted, your thoughts derivative, your world recursive. It is not the fear of being watched. It is the fear that there is no observer, no ground, no real. In this, Carcosa aligns with the philosophical anxieties of postmodernism and late capitalism, where the simulated and the real can no longer be disentangled. Ultimately, the core philosophical concepts embedded in Carcosa function not to terrify in the conventional sense, but to unmoor. They work slowly, by suggestion and implication, eroding the foundations of certainty. One need not see the Yellow King to be marked by him. One need only consider that he may have already been seen. In Carcosa, the journey is not toward understanding, but toward disintegration. The self, the world, the narrative, all collapse into dream. And so, as we turn next to the entities and forces that populate this decaying metaphysical landscape, we will find that they too are not characters in the traditional sense, but metaphors, living symbols of entropy, recursion, and the inescapable seduction of the unreal. In traditional mythologies, gods and monsters serve as explanatory figures, metaphysical scaffolding meant to reveal the hidden logic of the cosmos. But in Carcosa, the entities we encounter do not explain, they obscure. They are not originators of meaning, but catalysts for its unraveling. Foremost among these is the Yellow King, a being who exists not as a character, but as a conceptual infection, a presence that uncoils through symbols, dreams, and decaying identities. Chambers never defines him. He is not given a voice, a form, or a cosmology. He rules a city that may not exist, appears in a play that cannot be quoted in full, and wears a mask that cannot be removed. His function is destabilization. And this reveals something profound. The Yellow King is not a god in the mythological sense. He is a philosophical virus, an agent of aesthetic entropy, epistemic collapse, and psychological recursion. One does not worship him, one decays into him. The metaphysical implications of the Yellow King become clearer when placed alongside the beings that surround him in the Carcosan mythos. Hastur, the Lake of Hali, Aldebaran, and the Twin Suns. These names recur like sacred syllables, always half-remembered, always refracted through differing contexts. Take Hastur, for instance. In Chambers' work, it is ambiguous, sometimes a person, sometimes a place, sometimes a whisper. Later writers, particularly those influenced by August Derleth and the Call of Cthulhu mythos, attempted to fix Hastur as a definitive cosmic entity, a great old one, associated with air, madness, and decay. But this act of definition flattens what was originally a tool of conceptual instability. In Carcosa, Hastur is not a being to be confronted. It is a frequency to be infected by. Like the yellow sign, its power lies in suggestion, in the idea that you have already encountered it, perhaps in a name, a star, a dream, and failed to notice until it was too late. The same can be said of the Lake of Hali. It is not a location in any geographical sense. It is a mirror, a threshold, a symbolic body of water that refracts consciousness. In The Mask, it is referenced as a mysterious, almost divine place from which the Yellow King draws his presence. Yet the lake is never seen directly. It is always inferred, always spoken of in tones of reverent dread. Symbolically, it evokes the Lacanian real, a space beyond language and comprehension, where the subject dissolves and symbolic order breaks down. To see the Lake of Hali is not to gain knowledge, but to lose structure. It is not a portal to another world. It is a dissolution of this one. Compare this to Lovecraft's Dreamlands, where bodies of water like the Nameless Sea or Lake of Dole function as dream boundaries. Yet, unlike Lovecraft's geography, which is baroque and navigable, Chambers' mythos offers no cartography. Carcosa does not appear on any map. It appears on palimpsests of perception. This leads us to the celestial bodies that frame Carcosa's unnatural sky. Aldebaran, the Hyades, and the Twin Suns. These are not just set dressing. They are cosmological errors, signs that the rules of the universe have been altered or corrupted. Aldebaran is a real star in the Taurus constellation, and the Hyades is a legitimate star cluster, which makes their inclusion doubly uncanny. Their presence in the sky above Carcosa suggests that this city exists within our cosmos, and yet also outside it. It implies simultaneity, that Carcosa might be another planet, another dimension, or a metaphysical fold in consciousness. But none of these interpretations are ever confirmed. Instead, we are left with a sky we almost recognize, a sky that seems to whisper rather than shine. The twin suns, for instance, suggest multiplicity, contradiction, and impossible illumination. Twin suns cannot exist in our physics without tearing gravitational logic apart, and that is precisely the point. Carcosa is not sustained by physics but by contradiction. Its sky is not a ceiling, it is a signal. Entities like the Yellow King and Hastur, then, are not gods to be worshipped, but functions within a decaying symbolic system. They are forces of disintegration, masquerading as figures of myth, and this is what separates them from traditional cosmic horror deities. While Lovecraft's Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep suggest alien, intelligence, and existential threat, the beings of Carcosa imply a deeper horror, that there is no intelligence, no intention, only form without content. The Yellow King does not seek to dominate, he seeks to unwrite. His mask is not to hide a face, but to replace it. His presence does not announce itself through apocalypse, but through quiet shifts in perception. One no longer remembers how the story began. One forgets whether the self exists. He is entropy given the semblance of a crown. We might also consider these entities in the broader tradition of dream figures. Carcosa, like Lovecraft's dreamlands, functions as a dream reality, one that crosses into waking life through art, madness, and forbidden knowledge. But where Lovecraft often distinguishes dream from reality, Chambers blurs them. The Yellow King may be real, or he may be a figure in a play, or a hallucination induced by the play, or a metaphor for what happens when the mind tries to interpret beauty that has no source. This recursive uncertainty is central. Carcosa's entities are not beings. They are mimetic constructs, units of infection within a symbolic system that no longer has a ground. They operate like philosophical viruses, eroding certainty, distorting language, replacing ontology with mythographic residue. It is not that they destroy the world, it is that they reveal the world was never coherent to begin with. Ultimately, the entities of Carcosa are not characters in a story, but resonances in a decaying structure of thought. They do not act, they manifest. They are not explained, they recur. Their presence is felt not in narrative climax, but in semantic instability. One begins to repeat phrases, one begins to see signs, one begins to dream in symbols. And so, as we now turn to the human figures who encounter these entities, those fragile minds who mistake revelation for sanity, we will see that madness is not a punishment. It is a mirror. To meet the Yellow King is not to encounter a god. It is to glimpse the collapse of self into symbol. It is to realize that you have always lived in Carcosa. You simply forgot the name. If Carcosa is the architecture of symbolic decay, then human beings are its perfect inhabitants. Fragile, meaning-seeking organisms attempting to orient themselves within a reality that has already betrayed them. Unlike traditional horror, which often pits humanity against a monstrous external force, the Carcosan framework internalizes the threat. It is not the Yellow King who acts upon the human psyche. It is the human psyche that recognizes itself in the Yellow King's mirror. Madness, within this structure, is not a descent, but a transformation, a form of clarity so radical that it dismantles the subject. The narratives surrounding Carcosa are not tales of encounter, but of contagion, and that contagion is epistemological. To know of Carcosa is to begin forgetting everything else. The mind, once exposed to its logic, begins to rot in place. The self, once stable, becomes recursive. And this reveals something profound. In Carcosa, madness is not the exception. It is the condition of awareness. This is perhaps most clearly dramatized in Chambers' The Yellow Sign, in which the protagonist, a painter, comes into contact with a strange symbol and begins a slow, irreversible slide into psychosis. But the story resists conventional diagnosis. The painter is not hallucinating. The events he experiences have internal consistency. The creature that follows him, the dream that foretells disaster, the inexorable pull of the yellow sign, all proceed with dreamlike logic that undermines the real without directly violating it. Madness, in this context, becomes indistinguishable from perception. There is no moment of rupture. There is only a slow bleed between levels of reality, until narrative itself begins to operate by Carcosan rules. That is the horror, not that one goes mad, but that madness is the true grammar of the world. It is not simply that humans go mad in Carcosa. It is that Carcosa renders madness indistinguishable from insight. This inversion recalls the ancient trope of the seer, those cursed with knowledge that others dismiss as insanity. In Greek tragedy, Cassandra speaks the truth, but is never believed. In Carcosa, a similar dynamic unfolds, but with a fatal twist. The revelation is not prophetic. It is viral. The text of The King in Yellow functions not as forbidden knowledge in the Lovecraftian sense, but as epistemic malware, a symbolic system that overwrites the host's ability to distinguish between meaning and metaphor. In The Repairer of Reputations, Hildred's belief in his royal lineage may be delusional, but it is also disturbingly consistent. His madness has structure, ritual, symbols, elements of systematized belief, and that structure mimics the mythic form. Madness becomes mythology. Identity becomes narrative. Carcosa functions here not as setting, but as a semantic trap, converting the subject into a character within its own collapsing fiction. We must pause here to recognize a key distinction. In many horror traditions, madness is punitive, the price of forbidden inquiry. But in Carcosa, madness is participatory. It is not the result of seeing too much. It is the result of recognizing what has always been true. This is why the stories resist closure. The protagonists do not merely fall into insanity. They dissolve into the symbolic fabric of the narrative itself. Their thoughts become self-referential, their actions recursive, their language infected. Have you seen the yellow sign? Becomes a ritual question, not of curiosity, but of confirmation. It is not information being transferred, it is aesthetic contagion. And once spoken, it cannot be unspoken. The yellow sign, the name Carcosa, the Lake of Holly, these are not elements of a myth, they are vectors of a condition. One may draw a parallel here to the concept of mimetic, all hazard, a term popularized in speculative philosophy and fictional ontologies such as the SCP Foundation. A mimetic hazard is an idea so potent that it destabilizes the mind that contains it. Carcosa, through the play The King in Yellow, operates as precisely such a hazard. The play itself, never fully revealed, acts as the core transmission vector. It is not simply read. It is experienced in the way one experiences a religious revelation or a neurological event. And this is where Carcosa deviates most sharply from Lovecraftian horror. Lovecraft's knowledge breaks the mind by revealing humanity's insignificance in the cosmos. Carcosa's knowledge breaks the mind by revealing that the mind itself is the cosmos, and that both are already compromised. The terror is not in being small. The terror is in being constructed entirely from fictions. This horror of self-recognition, of the mind as a theater where symbols perform without origin, aligns closely with post-structuralist thought. Thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida argued that identity is not a fixed essence, but a function of language, discourse, and repetition. Carcosa enacts this idea not as philosophy, but as fate. Its characters do not discover their truths, they become overwritten by them. The Yellow King does not dominate, he infects. And once infected, the subject can no longer distinguish between mask and face, self and story. In this sense, Carcosa is not a city. It is a structure of symbolic recursion, a place where identity is no longer stable, and every thought echoes with the suggestion of prior authorship. And so, we return to madness, not as a fall, but as a medium. To enter Carcosa is not to lose oneself, but to become aware that the self was always a mask, that consciousness itself is a performance scripted by forces beyond our comprehension. The yellow sign does not awaken delusion. It awakens awareness. The play does not lie. It reveals that lying is the structure of language. In Carcosa, madness is not aberration. It is the recognition that all thought is fiction, and that the self is merely a character waiting for its lines. As we now move into the next dimension of this investigation, forbidden knowledge and epistemic collapse, we will find that Carcosa's greatest horror is not in what it reveals, but in how it teaches us to read, not truth, but its absence, not understanding, but the recursive echo of a city that teaches madness by rhythm, by resonance, by mask. In the Carcosan mythos, knowledge is never liberatory. It is parasitic. It arrives not as illumination, but as a slow corruption of cognitive boundaries, an awareness that undoes the structure of awareness itself. This inversion of the classical pursuit of knowledge is central to Carcosa's horror. The very act of seeking truth becomes the mechanism by which one loses all access to it. In contrast to Promethean myths of enlightenment or the Faustian quest for power, the Carcosan seeker does not gain knowledge. The seeker becomes known. By what or to what end remains unspecified. Because the knowledge in question is not propositional, not factual, but structural. It rewrites cognition from the inside. To read The King in Yellow is not to learn something terrible. It is to lose the capacity to distinguish what terrible means. And this reveals something profound. Forbidden knowledge in Carcosa is not dangerous because of its content, but because of its form, a recursive semiotic system that collapses the distinction between symbol and reality. This conceptual threat is encoded most directly in the fictional play itself, The King in Yellow, which recurs throughout Chambers' collection as a text that drives its readers to madness. But crucially, we never see the full play. Only fragments are revealed, always lyrical, strangely formal, and tantalizingly void of context. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies, but stranger still is lost Carcosa. These lines do not describe, they evoke, and in doing so, they resist containment within any clear interpretive frame. The play is never shown in full because its danger is not in what it says, but in how it functions. As a linguistic device that inserts its rhythms into the reader's mind, slowly replacing internal narrative with external pattern. We must recognize this as a literary simulation of mimetic infection. Carcosa's knowledge is not transmissible as content. It propagates through form, like a rhythm that cannot be forgotten once heard. Here, Carcosa aligns itself with a broader tradition of anti-epistemologies, structures of thought in which the pursuit of knowledge leads not to truth, but to collapse. We see a parallel in Lovecraft's Necronomicon, which also functions as a text that unmoors the reader from ordinary perception. But Lovecraft's forbidden knowledge often points outward, toward vast alien cosmologies. Carcosa turns inward. Its revelations concern not the size of the universe, but the instability of mind, language, and symbol. There is no monstrous God waiting in the deep. There is only the realization that our tools for understanding are themselves diseased. In this sense, Carcosa may be the more psychologically radical mythos. It does not frighten us with the unknown. It frightens us with the known, revealed to be recursive, arbitrary, and performative. It is not the world that is wrong. It is the act of meaning-making itself. This dynamic parallels several real-world philosophical traditions, most notably the post-structuralist critique of knowledge. Jacques Derrida, in deconstructing the Western metaphysical tradition, argued that language is inherently unstable, that meaning is always deferred, and that the center of any system is always absent. Carcosa dramatizes this absence. It is not a place that can be found. It is a placeholder, a signifier whose function is to collapse other signifiers. The Yellow King wears a mask not to hide, but to ensure that there is nothing beneath. The city itself exists only as reference, citation, and echo. The more we seek to define it, the more it dissolves. This epistemic collapse is not incidental. It is Carcosa's central engine. The forbidden knowledge at its heart is not secret content, but the loss of difference between sign and referent. In Carcosa, all roads lead to the same place, a city made of language, dreaming of itself. But Carcosa is not merely an allegory for postmodern theory. It is also a meditation on the limits of representation. The stories that orbit it, whether Chambers' originals or later expansions, are structured by fragmentation, recursive reference, and unreliable narration. They resist closure, they resist summary, and that resistance itself becomes a source of horror. When Hildred Castaigne claims royal lineage in The Repairer of Reputations, the story does not confirm or deny his delusion. It simply repeats his patterns. When the painter in The Yellow Sign succumbs to the symbol's influence, we are never told what the sign truly is. Instead, we watch his perception buckle under its weight. Knowledge here is not the product of synthesis. It is the symptom of collapse. The text itself becomes infected, and the reader is pulled into its decay. That is the nature of forbidden knowledge in Carcosa. It does not show you a monster. It shows you the erosion of the frame that distinguishes monster from meaning. This function of epistemic collapse has deep cultural resonance in the late 19th century when the Carcosa mythos first emerged. The era was marked by crises of knowledge, the rise of non-Euclidean geometry, the implications of Darwinian evolution, and the destabilizing effects of Freudian psychology, all contributed to the sense that the world was no longer coherent. Carcosa is a dream forged in that moment, a symbol of the growing suspicion that truth was no longer accessible, and perhaps never had been. It is the narrative expression of that philosophical vertigo, and its structure reflects that origin. There is no central authority in Carcosa, no stable origin, no definitive text. There is only transmission, repetition, fragmentation. The Yellow King does not rule by decree, he rules by echo. And so, forbidden knowledge in the Carcosan tradition becomes a metaphysical virus, a script that rewrites its reader, not by adding information, but by eroding the capacity to differentiate. The epistemic collapse it triggers is not a bug. It is the system functioning as intended. Every fragment of the play, every symbol of the sign, every glimpse of the city invites interpretation while withdrawing from it. This is not the horror of ignorance. It is the horror of recursive meaning, the realization that our hunger for pattern is what traps us. Carcosa is not unknowable because it is hidden. It is unknowable because it invites knowing, then renders all knowledge hollow. And as we now turn toward the literary manifestations of this mythos, its earliest appearances, major stories, and later expansions, we will see how these ideas are not merely philosophical. They are narrative structures. They are the engine by which fiction dreams itself into contagion. Every myth begins as an echo, and Carcosa is no exception. Long before Robert W. Chambers transformed the name into a locus of decadent terror, it appeared in Ambrose Bierce's brief but devastating story, An Inhabitant of Carcosa, 1886, a tale written when American letters still trembled with Civil War disillusionment. The story opens in medias res. A nameless narrator wanders a barren landscape, glimpsing toppled columns and weather-worn inscriptions, until he realizes, with dreadful calm, that he is walking through the ruins of his own city, and that he himself is dead. Bierce's prose is spare, almost repertorial. The light was dim, the air chill, the sky leaden with cloud. Yet within that restraint lies philosophical ferocity. Carcosa here is not a place of horror, but of metaphysical diagnosis, a revelation that consciousness persists only as afterimage. The city's desolation mirrors a post-war America haunted by absence. Meaning eroded, faith exhausted, history reduced to dust. Bierce's intent, we must recognize, was not to construct mythology, but to strip mythology away, leaving only the skeletal truth of mortality. In that vacuum, Chambers would later build his Palace of Masks. By the time Chambers published The King in Yellow in 1895, the cultural mood had shifted from Bierce's grim rationalism to fin de siècle aestheticism. What Bierce presented as ruin, Chambers recast as decadent dream. In the opening story, The Repairer of Reputations, Carcosa surfaces obliquely through references to a forbidden play circulating among artists and intellectuals. One character murmurs a fragment. Camilla. You, sir, should unmask. Stranger. Indeed. Casilda. Indeed, it's time. We all have laid aside disguise but you. And the very cadence of those lines alters the atmosphere of the tale. Unlike Bierce's revelation, which concludes the narrative, Chambers' invocation functions as contagion. The play, The King in Yellow, operates as metatext, a book within book, whose invisible content destabilizes every world that mentions it. Through this device, Chambers forges an unprecedented structure, a constellation of stories bound not by plot or character, but by infection. The myth's coherence emerges only through repetition, echo, and omission, a method later perfected by Lovecraft and Bierce. We must pause to consider how Chambers achieved this illusion of intertextual antiquity. He borrowed names not only from Bierce, but from astronomical catalogs, Aldebaran, the Hyalds, Hastur, each carrying the faint authority of science while resonating like fragments of sacred scripture. In The Court of the Dragon, the narrator flees through a Parisian church pursued by an organist whose music drives him toward revelation. Yet the pursuit ends not in theology, but in delirium, with the words, "Then I saw the King in Yellow for the first time." Nothing more is explained. The story's power arises precisely from its discontinuity, its suggestion of deeper connections the reader can never verify. This technique anticipates the mythographic realism that later defined weird fiction, the sense that every narrative is merely a shard of a vaster, unreadable archive. Chambers's innovation was to make the fragment itself the source of dread. Chambers's Carcosa also establishes an early example of narrative recursion, fiction aware of its own fictiveness. Each story references the play that destroys those who read it, implicating both characters and readers in the same peril. Have you seen the yellow sign? Becomes not dialogue, but challenge. The text addresses itself, looping meaning back into performance. In literary terms, this anticipates modern metafiction. In philosophical terms, it embodies the collapse between sign and referent described earlier. The Carcosan mythos thus evolves not by addition, but by iteration. Every repetition of the name, every allusion to the unseen play, recreates the city from linguistic residue. Carcosa survives through quotation, the way a melody survives even after its score is lost. It is not transmitted historically, but mimetically, a structure of recurrence masquerading as tradition. We can trace its early dissemination through contemporaneous readers and later writers who misread its boundaries. The editors of Weird Tales in the 1920s treated the names Hastur and Carcosa as interchangeable with Lovecraft's growing pantheon, while Lovecraft himself, ever the myth systematizer, appropriated them in The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, as fragments of occult scholarship. Yet the tone shifts profoundly in this migration. Lovecraft's references are archival, categorical, rationalized. Chambers's were atmospheric, dream poetic, unresolved. The difference is instructive. Lovecraft's mythos seeks coherence. Chambers's depends on its absence. In moving from Bierce's moral allegory to Chambers's aesthetic delirium to Lovecraft's cosmic taxonomy, we witness a trajectory from revelation to recursion, from truth discovered to meaning infected to meaning codified. Comparative analysis illuminates the unique role Carcosa plays within this lineage. Where Dunsany's dreamlands offer luminous fantasy, Carcosa offers anti-dream, a place of memory rather than imagination. Where Machen's great god Pan reveals spiritual ecstasy through terror, Chambers presents terror as purely aesthetic, beautiful, stylized, incurable. And where later, cosmic horror would externalize dread into monstrous entities, Carcosa internalizes it, embedding horror within language itself. The result is a mythic structure unlike any before it, a myth that cannot be recited without altering the speaker, not a system of belief, but a mechanism of contagion. This is the true legacy of its earliest appearances. Thus, from Bierce's spectral philosophy to Chambers's decadent recursion, Carcosa evolves as a self-replicating artifact of interpretation. Each iteration rewrites both its predecessors and its readers. The city that began as a ruined allegory becomes a living labyrinth of references, an experiment in narrative entropy that continues to expand by partial recollection. And as we now move to examine The Repairer of Reputations, the first and most complex of Chambers's Carcosan stories, we shall see how this contagion achieves its full psychological dimension, how the myth leaves the page, enters the mind, and transforms paranoia into metaphysical architecture. Published as the opening story of The King in Yellow, 1895, The Repairer of Reputations remains Chambers's most elaborate and destabilizing contribution to the Carcosan mythos, a piece of speculative fiction that, on its surface, presents an alternate history of America in the year 1920, but beneath that veneer unfolds as a text infected with ontological instability. The tale is narrated by Hildred Castaigne, a man recently released from an asylum after a fall from a horse, whose unreliability is established almost immediately. Yet it is not merely his mind that is in question. The world he describes, a militarized, vaguely authoritarian United States, with state-sanctioned euthanasia chambers and arcane aristocratic orders, may itself be diseased. Carcosa's presence in this story is less direct than in others, but it is far more invasive. It exists not in plot devices or monstrous apparitions, but in narrative structure itself. The reader is caught in a loop between Hildred's delusion and a reality that never quite confirms or denies it. Consider carefully. The horror here is not in being unable to believe the narrator. It is in realizing that belief is no longer a stable category. From the outset, Hildred presents himself as the heir to an esoteric royal lineage, tracing his authority through a mysterious book, The King in Yellow, which he claims reveals the truth of Carcosa, Hastur, and his rightful throne. The text of the play is never shown, but its consequences are made explicit. Hildred claims to have read it and shall read it again, though the first reading left me shattered. That line, with its contradictory yearning and despair, encapsulates the story's entire philosophical engine. The King in Yellow functions here not as plot device, but as epistemic infection, a semiotic key that unlocks a worldview incompatible with reason. Importantly, no other character confirms the book's existence, and Hildred's references to Carcosa, Hastur, and the yellow sign are never acknowledged by others. They are solipsistic loops embedded within his perception, and yet the world he sees is not wholly implausible. Therein lies the trap. Madness in this narrative is not the breakdown of reality. It is a reconfiguration of it into Carcosan pattern. The character of Mr. Wilde, the titular repairer, deepens this ambiguity. A grotesque figure who lives in a cluttered apartment with a vicious cat and claims to operate a shadowy organization controlling reputations across the globe. Wilde serves as Hildred's confidant and co-conspirator. But is he real, or an extension of Hildred's pathology? The text refuses to answer. Wilde may be physically present, but his role in the imperial dynasty of America suggests invention. Yet this ambiguity is precisely the point. Wilde is not a character, but a narrative function, a figure who reinforces the story's recursive collapse. His office is a spatial metaphor for Carcosa itself, claustrophobic, labyrinthine, filled with documents of unclear provenance, and ultimately inaccessible to external verification. He speaks of the Yellow King as though he were a political fact, a cosmic monarch whose return is imminent. Here, Carcosa is rendered not as a distant city, but as a political reality infiltrating consciousness, a hallucination that colonizes the everyday. What distinguishes The Repairer of Reputations from other stories in Chambers' collection is its use of false realism. The story opens with detailed descriptions of future New York City, armored police, suicide chambers, racial policies, architectural innovations that mimic the tone of science fiction or social satire. This creates a context that feels solid, concrete, but that solidity begins to dissolve as Hildred's narration grows more obsessive. By the story's midpoint, the reader is no longer certain whether they are reading a utopian prophecy, a dystopian fantasy, or a deranged dream. The Carcosan logic infects the form of the narrative itself, pulling it toward madness not through shock, but through consistency. Hildred's world makes internal sense. That is what makes it terrifying. It is not madness as chaos. It is madness as coherent alternative, a solipsistic regime in which meaning loops back on itself until all external reference is lost. This structure mirrors the function of the yellow sign, not a symbol that reveals, but one that replicates. A particularly revealing moment comes near the story's end, when Hildred reflects on the events leading to his cousin's wedding, the moment when his imagined kingdom collapses. "I heard every word," he writes, "but understood nothing. My world had vanished like mist." Here, the reader sees the final undoing not just of Hildred's delusion, but of the text's narrative stability. The world that had seemed so strangely plausible disintegrates in a paragraph. But it is not replaced with clarity. Instead, the story ends with Hildred once again institutionalized and no clear resolution. Was it madness all along? Or is madness in Carcosa simply what remains when others refuse to recognize the truth? The lack of closure is not a flaw, it is the philosophical payload. Carcosa is not about answers. It is about structures of interpretation that eat themselves. We must recognize that in The Repairer of Reputations, Chambers anticipated key themes of 20th century literature: unreliable narration, subjective reality, psychological recursion. The story predates The Trial, Naked Lunch, and Pale Fire, yet it operates within the same ontological fog. It is not the precursor to Lovecraft's cosmic horror in tone, but it prefigures the philosophical drift of cosmic horror, the shift from monsters to models, from threats that exist out there, to threats embedded in the way we construct knowledge itself. Hildred is not wrong in a Lovecraftian sense. He is wrong in a Carcosan sense. He has begun to read the world in symbols, and the symbols have replaced the world. Ultimately, The Repairer of Reputations functions not as a traditional horror tale, but as a case study in symbolic infection. Carcosa is never named as a destination, but it is present in every sentence. The play, the sign, the king, none of them appear in full, yet they govern the logic of the narrative. Hildred's delusion is not an aberration. It is a revelation, glimpsed through a mirror that refuses to clarify. As we next turn to The Yellow Sign, we will see how this infection intensifies, how beauty, love, and the artistic impulse become the next vectors of Carcosan collapse. For in that tale, Carcosa moves from crown to canvas, from paranoia to passion, and in doing so reveals that its truest function is not to destroy, but to seduce. If The Repairer of Reputations introduces Carcosa as a political delusion, The Yellow Sign, 1895, reveals it as an aesthetic contagion, a revelation born through art, desire, and decay. It is perhaps Chambers' most haunting and structurally refined story, one in which the metaphysical infection of the Yellow King manifests through the intimate act of artistic creation. The unnamed painter protagonist, working in New York, meets Tessie, a young model whose beauty is marred only by her obsession with a dream of her own death. Their relationship, fragile and tender, becomes the vessel through which Carcosa enters the material world. The catalyst is not violence or ritual, but artistic attention itself, the painter's vision, sharpened by longing, opening a fissure between perception and revelation. As in Repairer, the forbidden text, The King in Yellow makes its spectral appearance, this time as a literal book the painter reads, shattering the barrier between reality and symbol. What follows is not possession in the supernatural sense, but translation, the human mind converted into a medium, for a city that dreams through color, sound, and fever. The first sign of this infection arrives in the form of the Watchman, the corpse-like figure who haunts the churchyard below the painter's window. His appearance, a fat, flabby face, dead white, with eyelids that never closed, prefigures the story's collapse of life and death, beauty and corruption. Tessie fears him instinctively, calling him the man of my dreams. The narrator, at first rational, cannot reconcile the creature's repulsive vitality with its unmistakable aura of death. Here Chambers uses the grotesque not for shock, but for ontological dissonance, the body that moves though lifeless, the eye that watches without will. The Watchman is Carcosa's emissary, a walking contradiction, and his gaze functions like the Yellow Sign itself, an emblem that annihilates boundaries simply by being seen. In him, aesthetic horror becomes metaphysical. He is not a ghost or ghoul. He is the proof that perception itself is already diseased. The pivotal scene occurs when the painter finally reads The King in Yellow, the play within the book that serves as the myth's secret heart. Chambers offers only brief excerpts. Camilla, you, sir, should unmask. Stranger, indeed, Casilda, indeed it's time. We all have laid aside disguise, but you. Those lines, repeated from Repairer, act as linguistic contagion. They carry with them the echo of infinite repetition. The painter's reaction is telling. I could not put it down. It seemed written in my own brain. Knowledge here is not discovery, but recognition, as if the text had been waiting inside him. The play's second act reveals the horror that is Carcosa, and afterward, I knew the Yellow Sign, and my soul cried out for what it had lost. These sentences enact epistemic collapse, reading as remembering, understanding as infection. The book within the book erases the distinction between author, reader, and subject, turning artistic creation into a vector of madness. The painter's studio becomes another chamber in Carcosa, a place where art consumes its maker. The story's climax unites the erotic, the aesthetic, and the metaphysical. After the painter dreams of the Watchman entering his studio, Tessie confesses her own recurring nightmare of lying dead in his arms while a white worm crawled from my heart to yours. This grotesque image fuses love and putrefaction, tenderness and entropy. When the Watchman finally enters the room in waking life, breaking the physical boundary between dream and day, the symbolic becomes literal. The painter shoots him, only to discover that the corpse is indeed a corpse, already rotting, its hand clutching the yellow sign. Tessie dies instantly. The painter soon follows, whispering, "It is the yellow sign." The narrative dissolves into fevered fragments, the language itself infected with repetition and decay. The story ends where it began, with death mistaken for life and life mistaken for dream. It is not resolution, but absorption. The characters consumed by the semiotic system they invoked. Thematically, the yellow sign transforms the intellectual paranoia of repairer into aesthetic fatalism. Madness here is not political or cosmic, but artistic. The act of seeing, painting, and interpreting becomes inherently corruptive. Chambers anticipates the modernist anxiety that art no longer reveals truth but manufactures illusion, a fear that would later haunt Wilde's Dorian Gray and Pirandello's metatheater. Tessie's beauty is inseparable from mortality, the painter's genius indistinguishable from self-annihilation. Carcosa operates as both muse and tomb. The Yellow King, never glimpsed, is the spirit of aesthetic exhaustion, the point at which representation collapses into self-reference. To love beauty in Carcosa is to love the mechanism of decay. This is not merely decadent sentiment, it is ontological critique. In a universe where meaning itself rots, art becomes the last surviving instinct, a futile attempt to sculpt form from entropy. We must recognize how Chambers orchestrates this collapse linguistically. The story's diction alternates between lyrical excess and abrupt simplicity, mirroring the oscillation between dream and reality. Sentences like, "Outside, the sparrows were twittering in the sunlight, yet I could not move," juxtapose vitality and paralysis, creating a rhythm of suspended time. The prose becomes an aesthetic correlative for Carcosa's metaphysics, stillness that trembles, brightness that blinds, knowledge that unknows. Even the story's title, The Yellow Sign, functions as paradox. A sign presupposes meaning, yet this sign signifies only its own corrosion. In semiotic terms, it is a self-negating symbol, a glyph whose referent is erasure. Every repetition of its name deepens the void it denotes. It is not revelation, but recursion. Finally, the yellow sign completes Chambers' philosophical transition from Bierce's moral allegory to the full epistemological horror of modernity. The human figures no longer confront death as a boundary, they inhabit it as medium. Art, once the mirror of the real, becomes the engine of unreality. The watchman's smile, the painter's ecstasy, Tessie's fading breath, all echo the same refrain. Strange is the night where black stars rise. The story's final gesture, collapse through recognition, cements Carcosa's legacy as an aesthetic archetype, beauty as contagion, knowledge as undoing, and love as the final illusion that binds the dream together. As we proceed to the collaborative and later expansions of this mythos, we will see how subsequent authors, Derleth, Lovecraft, Wagner, and others, attempted to domesticate this formless dread, transforming Carcosa's ambiguous delirium into structured mythology, and, in doing so, perhaps betraying the very principle that made it terrifying, its refusal to mean. The myth of Carcosa, born in Bierce's spectral minimalism and expanded into Chambers' decadent delirium, did not conclude with the king in yellow. Instead, it metastasized, slowly, unevenly, and often unconsciously, into the broader mythopoeic ecosystem of 20th century horror. The evolution of Carcosa into a shared universe concept, particularly through the efforts of H.P. Lovecraft, August Derleth, and their literary successors, marks a profound transformation from ambiguous literary recursion into systematized cosmology. Yet this shift, while historically significant, invites philosophical tension, for Carcosa resists order. It undoes structure. To codify it is to constrain it. And yet, paradoxically, that very codification enabled its survival. This reveals something profound. Myths do not persist by remaining unchanged. They persist by adapting to the fears of each new generation. Lovecraft's role in this process is both subtle and essential. He never wrote explicitly about Carcosa, nor did he adapt Chambers' Yellow King directly. However, in stories such as The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, and in various letters, Lovecraft adopted and recontextualized Hastur, one of Chambers's peripheral names, into the growing taxonomy of his Cthulhu mythos. In Lovecraft's usage, Hastur becomes a kind of forbidden name, possibly a location, possibly a being, associated with dreadful cosmic knowledge. But he is vague, even evasive. In a letter to August Derleth dated 1931, Lovecraft writes, "I have employed Hastur, chiefly for its dark and sonorous suggestion. That phrase, sonorous suggestion, captures the transitional logic perfectly. Lovecraft does not absorb Chambers' metaphysics wholesale. He borrows resonance, using Carcosa's vocabulary to deepen the echo of his own mythic terrain. It is not imitation, but harmonization." Derleth, however, pursued a very different course. As Lovecraft's self-appointed literary executor, August Derleth made it his mission to expand the mythos into a coherent cosmology. In works like The Return of Hastur, 1939, and later stories collected by Arkham House, Derleth positioned the Yellow King and Carcosa within a dualistic framework of elemental beings, great old ones representing evil, Hastur among them, and elder gods representing good. This restructured universe introduced moral binaries, cosmological hierarchies, and consistent geographical references. Carcosa was no longer an infection of symbol, it was a planet. Hastur was no longer a name that dissolved the mind. He was a defined entity, often linked to air and madness, and even opposed to Cthulhu in some narratives. In doing so, Derleth stabilized the myth, but in stabilizing it, he perhaps disenchanted it. The Yellow King's madness became an attribute. Carcosa became a location. The recursive ambiguity of Chambers's world was translated into gameable categories, and it was precisely this systematization that made Carcosa ripe for adaptation into tabletop role-playing. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981 by Chaosium, introduced the Yellow Sign, the King, and Carcosa as integral elements of its lore. In these modules, Carcosa became mappable, the Yellow King statted, and the sign something that could cause sand loss on a die roll. This represents both a diminution and a reinvention. On the one hand, the reduction of the Yellow King to a monster with hit points strips away the myth's symbolic density. On the other, the participatory nature of RPGs allowed Carcosa to thrive in new ways. Players didn't just read about the Yellow King, they encountered him. Not in the fatalistic stillness of a Chambers story, but in a mutable, improvisational space. In this form, Carcosa became a ritual engine, endlessly restaged in fictional worlds. Writers outside the direct Lovecraftian lineage also revisited Carcosa. Carl Edward Wagner, in the 1970s, infused the myth with his own nihilistic aesthetics. His story, The River of Nights Dreaming, 1981, reimagines Carcosa as a psychological landscape inhabited by damaged women and dream-haunted institutions, a reinterpretation that centers trauma rather than myth. Similarly, Caitlin R. Kiernan, in stories like Andromeda Among the Stones and The Yellow Alphabet, returns Carcosa to its original liminal status, a place glimpsed in the margins of dreams, art, and madness. These reinterpretations reject Derleth's taxonomy, opting instead for atmospheric revivalism. The Yellow King returns, not as cosmic villain, but as conceptual presence embedded in language, color, and decay. The most culturally influential modern revival, however, came in 2014 with HBO's True Detective, Season 1. In this series, creator Nick Pizzolatto invoked Carcosa, the Yellow King, and the Yellow Sign as motifs within a grim Southern Gothic detective story. The references are deliberately oblique. Carcosa is spoken of in hushed tones by murderers and madmen. The Yellow King is never shown. The final location, a ruined fort overgrown with occult symbolism, is Carcosa in everything but name, a space of dream logic and ritual collapse. The show does not literalize Chambers' myth. It appropriates its structure, madness as infection, knowledge as unreality, symbol as symptom. Time is a flat circle, says one character, echoing Niaishi's eternal return and the Carcosan motif of recursion. Here, the myth operates as cultural shorthand for the failure of reason, the rot beneath civilization, and the seductive pull of systems we cannot comprehend. Across these expansions, we see not a single lineage, but multiple evolutions. Carcosa becomes a planet, a ruin, a memory, a meme. The Yellow King becomes a monster, a metaphor, a murder cult symbol. Each reinterpretation changes the myth, but none erase its core structure, the collapse of epistemic boundaries, the transformation of knowledge into affliction. Even when constrained by systems, Carcosa infects them. This is the paradox of its afterlife. The more one tries to define it, the more it slips back into ambiguity. The more it is adapted, the more it insists on repetition, not revelation. Ultimately, Carcosa's persistence across derivative works speaks not to the strength of its lore, but to the power of its absence. Its meaning is never fully there, and thus always available. As it passed from Bierce to Chambers to Lovecraft, Derleth, and beyond, it became not a canon, but a rhizome, a web of disconnected yet resonant ideas, proliferating laterally through literature, games, television, and online folklore. And as we now turn toward its cultural and psychological afterlife, we must ask, what happens when a myth, born of decay, becomes indistinguishable from the culture it infected? When Carcosa is no longer just fiction, but an operating condition of our symbolic environment? For a myth to persist, it must outgrow its original medium. Carcosa, born in fiction and sustained through intertextual ritual, has long since transcended the printed page. It now lives in fragments, hoaxes, and urban legends, blurring the distinction between literary allusion and occult folklore. Though Robert W. Chambers never intended Carcosa to function as a spiritual or metaphysical proposition, the myth's structural ambiguity and resonant symbolism have made it ripe for appropriation. In online forums, fringe occult circles, conspiracy communities, and aesthetic subcultures, Carcosa is increasingly treated not as a literary device, but as a latent reality, an alternate layer of perception that reveals itself through synchronicities, dreams, symbols, and decaying memories. This reveals something profound. In a culture saturated by simulation and craving transcendence, the most powerful myths are those that behave like viruses, untraceable, self-replicating, and plausibly deniable. A persistent thread in Carcosa's real-world afterlife involves the so-called yellow sign sightings, reports circulating since the late 1990s on fringe websites and digital occult zines. These anecdotes describe symbols found on abandoned buildings, carved into rocks near riverbeds, or appearing inexplicably in dreams. The symbol in question often resembles a coiled spiral or broken triskelion, though no canonical version exists. That is part of the myth's resilience. The absence of verification invites replication. One poster on an early 2000s Usenet thread claimed to have encountered a carved glyph near Joshua Tree, accompanied by an overwhelming sensation of misremembered music. Another described the sudden onset of insomnia after encountering a yellow-marked envelope inside a little free library in Vermont. Its contents: a fragment of a play titled The King in Yellow, Act 2, Scene 1. These stories are unverifiable by design. The internet, with its hunger for alternate realities and archiveless truths, became the perfect medium for Carcosa to metastasize. Urban legends have long thrived on names without sources, and Carcosa's language is uniquely suited to this ecology. Names like Hastur, Hali, Aldebaran, and Casilda sound ancient, but belong to no known tradition. This linguistic rootlessness allows believers and hoaxers alike to weave them into diverse narratives, from missing time phenomena to dream cults to postmodern hauntology. For instance, a 2015 Reddit thread in R Unresolved Mysteries detailed a series of disappearances in rural Louisiana, loosely connected by journals that referenced the Court of the Yellow King and the Sign Beneath the Black Stars. Despite clear fictional stylings, the thread gained traction, with users cross-referencing local obituaries and abandoned properties. The boundary between metafiction and mimetic folklore blurred entirely. It is not that anyone believed in Carcosa as a literal geography. It is that they behaved as if its aesthetic had explanatory power. In this way, Carcosa became a myth of participation, activated not by belief, but by performance. In occult and magical subcultures, Carcosa's absorption has taken a more deliberate form. Esoteric practitioners influenced by chaos magic, a movement that embraces fictional systems as functional magical paradigms, have incorporated the yellow sign into ritual sigils, meditations, and dream-working techniques. In Peter Carroll's framework, belief is a tool, not a truth. Thus, Carcosa can be treated as a real psychic domain because its symbolic gravity exerts real psychological effects. Certain grimoire-style texts, circulated anonymously online, describe rituals intended to invoke the masked lord of the Hollow Court, often accompanied by cryptic glyphs and poetic invocations. One such text, the Canticle of Black Stars, contains stanzas like, "Speak not the king's name, lest the lake awaken, where memory drowns and suns do double burn." Whether these texts were written in earnest or as literary experiments is beside the point. In Carcosa, intention is irrelevant. Every repetition becomes ritual. This cultural parasitism has also extended into urban exploration and liminal photography communities. Instagram pages and Tumblr blogs dedicated to ruin porn often caption their photos with Carcosan references. Abandoned stairwells labeled Road to Halley. Crumbling auditoriums tagged with, "Have you seen the yellow sign?" The effect is cumulative. The aesthetic of Carcosa, ruin, silence, reflection, dislocation, becomes a frame through which participants filter their experiences. The city is never named outright, but its grammar is present. A fascination with thresholds, echoing symbols, and the suspicion that meaning has quietly expired. One could argue that this is not mythology at all, but mood. Yet that would miss the point. Carcosa's mythos does not require belief. It only requires repetition with affect. A photo, a tag, a glyph scratched into plaster. The city reveals itself not through revelation, but through citation. The underlying mechanism at work here is not new. Carcosa's mythic behavior mirrors that of other invented geographies that have migrated from fiction to fringe belief: Agharda, Shambhala, Atlantis. Each began as literary or esoteric speculation and became, over time, containers for collective projection. What distinguishes Carcosa is its lack of esoteric promise. It offers no enlightenment, no utopia, no transcendence, only aesthetic decay, recursive symbolism, and the erosion of certainty. This makes it uniquely suited to the late modern sensibility, a cultural moment defined not by metaphysical hunger, but by hauntological nostalgia, the longing for futures that never arrived, the feeling that time is stuck, looping, glitching. In this environment, Carcosa becomes not a prophecy, but a diagnosis. It does not point forward, it identifies what already is. Ultimately, the emergence of Carcosa in hoaxes, sightings, and digital myth-making is not a deviation from its literary origin. It is its natural evolution. The myth thrives in partial citation, fragmented context, aesthetic resonance. Its truth lies not in historical continuity, but in synthetic memory, the sense that we've always known its name, always dreamed of its towers, always glimpsed the yellow sign just before waking. As we turn next to its formal adaptations in film, music, and games, we will see how this logic of recurrence, half remembered, half invented, continues to animate Carcosa's cultural presence. For in the age of the algorithm, the deepest myths are not those with answers, but those that endlessly return without ever explaining themselves. The resurgence of Carcosa in contemporary media represents not merely a revival, but a transformation of its narrative function. From literature into visual and interactive forms, the myth's migration is defined by selective evocation, aesthetic curation, and strategic ambiguity. Rather than retelling Chambers' stories verbatim, modern adaptations deploy Carcosa and its symbols as unstable motifs, recurring but never fully explicated. This is consistent with the core logic of the mythos. Carcosa is not a fixed narrative location, but a contagion of suggestion. The Yellow King does not require presence. He requires proximity. And in our age of layered media, that proximity has taken many forms: television, video games, music, art installations, each one reinforcing the city's ontological slippage between fiction and recognition. Perhaps the most influential adaptation in recent memory is HBO's True Detective, Season 1, 2014. Created by Nick Pizzolatto, the series embeds references to the King in Yellow, Carcosa, and the Yellow Sign into a grim Southern Gothic crime narrative. Characters speak of the Yellow King in hushed tones, a child victim draws spiral glyphs resembling the sign, and the show's antagonist claims to have visited Carcosa, the Black Stars, the place where time is a flat circle. These fragments never cohere into a mythology. That is their power. Carcosa, in True Detective, is not a place but a condition, a mental ruin caused by long-term exposure to trauma, abuse, and systemic rot. Critics and viewers alike were struck not by the literal presence of Chambers' mythos, but by its atmospheric function. Carcosa is invoked the way one might recall a dream too vivid to be false and too incoherent to explain. It does not resolve the narrative, it infects it. As one detective says, we didn't get them all, we never do. Video games, particularly those engaged with psychological horror and dream logic architecture, have also become fertile ground for Carcosan imagery. In From Software's Bloodborne, 2015, the Yellow King does not appear, but his essence is everywhere. The game's decaying Gothic city, Yharnam, filled with inscrutable rituals, celestial nightmares, and cryptic symbols, mirrors Carcosa's aesthetic grammar. The moon presence, the mad ones, the nightmare of Mensis, all evoke Chambers' dream persecution logic. Moreover, one of the game's late-stage bosses, Mikolash, host of the nightmare, quotes Chambers directly. "Have you seen the Yellow Sign?" This line, spoken amid a surreal boss fight in a dream dimension of shifting staircases and echoing laughter, is a deliberate invocation of narrative collapse. The player becomes not simply a participant, but a character trapped within a Carcosan script. Bloodborne does not adapt the King in Yellow. It rebuilds its logic in a medium where dream, action, and knowledge are mechanically intertwined. Other games such as Control, 2019, and Alan Wake 2, 2023, developed by Remedy Entertainment, also draw heavily from Carcosan narrative mechanics. Control, with its Federal Bureau of Control investigating altered world events, mirrors the mythos' treatment of knowledge as infectious. The ashtray maze, a shifting architectural space that resists logic and direction, might be read as a Carcosan room in all but name. Similarly, Alan Wake 2 uses metafiction, recursive storytelling, and layered diegesis to blur the lines between author, protagonist, and reader. These narratives share a Carcosan DNA, not in content, but in structure. The myth is not what happens. It is how the story behaves, fragmentary, circular, reflective, and diseased. In music too, Carcosa has made its mark. Dark ambient, drone metal, and ritual electronic genres have all appropriated the Yellow King and Carcosa as sonic motifs. Bands like Gnaw Their Tongues, Akira Yamaoka, and Bowan have used Carcosan references to frame soundscapes that evoke rot, dreaming, and decentered identity. Notably, the metal band Hastur, whose name is an explicit homage, incorporates whispering chants, reverse text samples, and cyclical chord structures meant to simulate the sensation of recursive unreality. Even mainstream bands have referenced the myth obliquely. In Tool's 10,000 Days, listeners have pointed out that lyrics from Rosetta Stoned mirror themes from The King in Yellow, unreliable memory, hallucinated knowledge, and the threat that everything understood is a lie. The Yellow Sign, in these musical contexts, becomes not a symbol, but a tone, a minor key progression that never resolves. Visual culture and digital aesthetics have also embraced Carcosa as an ambient theme. In liminal space photography, one often finds captions referencing the Yellow King or the road to Hali. TikTok edits and Instagram reels superimpose decaying structures with cryptic text. Casilda waits at dusk. Do not look at the black star. These artifacts create the impression that Carcosa has become a distributed hallucination, expressed in pixels and vibes. Unlike traditional adaptations, these instances do not attempt to narrate Carcosa, they tune into it. The myth becomes an emotional register, part nostalgia, part dread, perfectly calibrated for an internet culture obsessed with unreality, glitches, and the uncanny. What all these adaptations share is not fidelity to the source, but allegiance to the feeling Carcosa evokes. the sense that something is broken in the symbolic order, that perception itself has turned traitor. This is why the myth thrives in media that emphasize repetition, reflection, and multi-layered narrative. Carcosa cannot be adapted directly without killing its ambiguity. Instead, creators invoke it ritually, through structure, color, rhythm, and intertextual reference. Its symbols become like musical notes: the yellow sign, the masked stranger, the twin suns, the lake of holly. These are not plot points, they are resonant echoes, artifacts of a myth that works best when it feels remembered rather than read. And so, Carcosa survives not by being reinterpreted, but by being reenacted. Each adaptation becomes a new performance in a long symbolic ritual, a television scene, a background glyph in a game, a lyric murmured over drone tones. None of these iterations claim ownership. Instead, they participate in a myth that teaches recurrence, that rewards pattern recognition, while always withholding the pattern. As we now turn to Carcosa's academic and subcultural appropriations, we will see how its afterlife has become not just artistic, but theoretical, a structure of thought through which culture, language, and identity are refracted and undone. The Yellow King wears many masks, and in this next phase, we must consider one more, that of the philosopher. While Carcosa began as a literary invention and evolved into an aesthetic infection, its most surprising transformation may be in its adoption as a conceptual framework across academic disciplines and subcultural movements. In these spaces where fiction and theory collide, Carcosa functions less as narrative and more as lens. It is not simply read, referenced, or performed. It is used as a tool for understanding identity, symbolic breakdown, and the crisis of modern meaning. What began as a fragment of decadent horror fiction has become a theoretical site of inquiry, a shared symbolic grammar for a world increasingly defined by simulation, ritual, and the erasure of truth. We must recognize, in subcultural theory and philosophical critique, Carcosa is no longer just a city. It is a model of thought. In academia, particularly within literary theory, psychoanalysis, and post-structuralist philosophy, Carcosa appears as a metaphor for recursive textuality and the implosion of interpretive stability. Lacanian scholars have read the yellow sign as a representation of the object petit a, the unreachable object of desire that structures all meaning. The sign's very absence, its refusal to be clearly visualized, makes it a perfect analog for Lacan's real, that which resists symbolization and returns as trauma. Similarly, in the Derridean sense, Carcosa is a different city, always deferred, never present, always inscribed in trace. Carcosa cannot be reached because it is constituted through delay, echo, and citation. It is not a text, but a metatext, constantly referring to its own unreliability. This conceptual slipperiness has made it fertile ground for critical theory syllabi, particularly in courses examining horror as cultural pathology. Philosophers such as Eugene Thacker and Mark Fisher have gestured toward Carcosa-adjacent frameworks in their analysis of horror, hauntology, and the limits of human knowledge. In Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, the idea of a world without us mirrors Carcosa's structure, a reality indifferent to meaning, resistant to language, fundamentally uninhabitable by human thought. Fisher's hauntology, The Return of Lost Futures, echoes Carcosa's temporal recursion. The city always seems to be from the future, or the distant past, but never the present. In this framing, Carcosa is not merely a story, it is a symptom of late capitalist time, a city that should have existed, a possibility that decayed before being realized, a mythic container for cultural exhaustion. Subculturally, Carcosa has been adopted by digital occultists, online esoteric communities, and aesthetic collectives operating in the liminal spaces of the internet. Sites like Tumblr, Reddit, and TikTok, as well as forums such as 8kuns x Sas, have hosted ongoing experiments with Carcosa gnosis, a hybrid of creative writing, ambient storytelling, and ritualized roleplay. These communities treat Carcosa not as metaphor, but as a reality accessible through symbol. Dream journals, sigil designs, AI-generated photographs of ruins under twin suns. These are acts of fictional mysticism, wherein participants don't necessarily believe in Carcosa, but act as if belief were the ritual. This as-if mode mirrors the tenets of chaos magic, where belief is tactical, and fiction functions as metaphysical software. In such circles, The King in Yellow is not a book, it is a keyframe, a symbol set from which new iterations of self and story can be invoked. One particularly fascinating appropriation occurs in the world of online alternate reality games, ARGs, and collaborative fiction projects. Communities such as the SCP Foundation and the Library of Babel have incorporated Carcosa-like structures into their mythic world building. SCP entries referencing non-Euclidean citadels beneath twin suns, or anomalous sigils that rewrite narrative continuity echo chambers without attribution. The yellow sign, or its variants, appears embedded in interface designs, scattered across hyperlinks, or encoded in visual glitches. These acts of symbolic citation do not rely on reader recognition. Rather, they function like ceremonial language, evoking tone and structure regardless of prior knowledge. The myth spreads not through canonical retelling, but ritualized repetition within digital mythographies. In visual and performance art, Carcosa has emerged as an icon of unreality. Installations featuring recursive architecture, decayed signage, or video loops referencing the Masked King appear in gallery shows, aligned with the new aesthetic or post-internet art movements. Performance artists have staged live readings of The King in Yellow, while audience members wear mirrored masks or sit beneath ultraviolet lights, destabilizing time and identity. These experiences enact Carcosa not as narrative, but as condition, an atmosphere of crumbling context, performative identity, and semiotic erosion. In this sense, the Yellow King becomes a patron figure for art that performs its own decay, not an antagonist, but a curator of the unfinished. Yet the most powerful reason Carcosa persists within subcultural and academic spaces is that it feels true, not in its details, but in its structure. We live in an era where knowledge collapses into noise, where identity is performed across fractured media, and where every symbol carries the weight of recursion. Carcosa offers a language for this disorientation. Its refusal to resolve mirrors our epistemic condition. Its recurrence mimics our algorithmic loops. It does not explain the world, it echoes it. And that echo, repeated through theory, memes, rituals, and critique, creates the illusion, perhaps the reality, that Carcosa is no longer a fiction we read, but a space we already inhabit. As we move to our final reflection on Carcosa's enduring psychological and philosophical implications, we will ask not what the myth has become, but what it has revealed. For in the end, Carcosa may be less about what it means, and more about what it displaces: reason, selfhood, certainty. And when these are gone, what remains may not be horror at all, but silence. A silence shaped like a city shaped like a question that remembers you. What remains once the story has been told, once the symbols have been repeated into abstraction, and once the city has been glimpsed from every angle but never entered? Carcosa, in its final form, is not a narrative, not a symbol, and not even a place. It is a psychological architecture, a mythic condition that reconfigures the self's relationship to reality, memory, and meaning. Its endurance is not due to its lore, but to its psychic function, a kind of mental topology that haunts the symbolic frameworks we use to make sense of experience. As a fictional construct, it offers no doctrine, no prophecy, no salvation. And yet, like a dream we cannot unremember, Carcosa stays. It loops, it waits. The deeper question is not why the myth persists, but why it increasingly feels like it was always there, under the surface of modern thought, waiting to be named. At its most fundamental level, Carcosa embodies the terror of self-recognition in a disordered system. To read the yellow sign, to see the twin suns, or hear the king's name, is to experience a form of epistemic inversion, where knowledge reveals not more of the world, but less. Not certainty, but decay. This mirrors key currents in 20th and 21st century philosophy, from existentialist dread to postmodern relativism. Where traditional mythologies offer cosmic narratives of creation and order, Carcosa offers cosmic recursion, the recognition that meaning itself is subject to entropy. One does not reach enlightenment in Carcosa. One realizes that the desire for enlightenment was already part of the performance. This aligns with philosophical pessimism, from Schopenhauer's will to nothingness to Ligotti's cosmic horror of consciousness, where the world is not hostile, but indifferent, and meaning is a psychological necessity projected onto an uncaring void. In psychological terms, Carcosa has become a metaphor for ontological insecurity, the feeling that the self is not grounded, that identity is porous, that reality is slipping. It is no accident that so many modern references to Carcosa occur in narratives centered on trauma, mental illness, addiction, or memory loss. From True Detective to Alan Wake, Carcosa functions as a symbolic stand-in for cognitive fragmentation. The city does not destroy, it mirrors what is already fracturing. One might interpret this as a metaphor for dissociation, the eerie sensation of observing one's own thoughts as if they belong to another, or for depersonalization, the haunting recognition that the self is merely a role being performed. Carcosa does not cause madness. It reveals that madness is already the grammar of modern consciousness. Consider this carefully. In Carcosa, the mad are not outliers. They are the only ones who see the shape of things. We must also acknowledge the myth's resonance with the experience of temporal collapse. The city is always already decaying, yet it never quite disappears. The suns do not set. The black star never fully rises. Time loops, but never concludes. In a culture increasingly obsessed with nostalgia, with reboots, with hauntological aesthetics, Carcosa speaks to a shared anxiety that the future has been canceled, that we are trapped in a moment that will not end. Mark Fisher described this as the slow cancellation of the future, and Carcosa can be understood as its metaphysical symbol, a place where time has become architecture, where repetition is fate, and where memory is indistinguishable from fiction. It is not that we have forgotten the way forward, it is that we can no longer distinguish progress from ritual performance. Carcosa is the city that mourns the possibility of endings. And what of the Yellow King? He remains in many ways the ultimate symbol of Carcosa's psychological function. Not a character, not a god, but a mask with no face behind it. A crown without a kingdom. In psychoanalytic terms, he resembles the phantom father, an absent origin, invoked but never embodied. He is authority detached from justice, form without content. This absence makes him perfect for projection, which is precisely what fuels his continued appearance across subcultural mythologies. One sees the Yellow King, where one is already collapsing, already unraveling. He is the ruler of abandoned frameworks, not a sovereign to fear, but an emblem of systemic exhaustion. In his court, language still moves, but without purpose. Symbols recur, but without reference. The king, in his yellow tatters, rules not a realm, but a rhythm. Yet perhaps the most unsettling implication of Carcosa is this. What if it is not wrong? What if its logic of decay, repetition, and symbolic erosion is not a deviation, but a revelation of how the world already functions beneath the surface? In this reading, Carcosa becomes not a distortion of reality, but a hyper-lucid model of it. A model in which the pursuit of knowledge always loops back on itself, in which every mask hides another mask, and in which meaning is not discovered, but continually generated and consumed. This is not nihilism. It is recursive semiotics as existential condition. In such a world, the horror is not that the yellow sign exists. The horror is that everything else might already bear its shape. And so, we end, not with closure, but with echo. Carcosa persists because it offers no end. It asks no belief, demands no dogma, reveals no final truth. Instead, it invites repetition, a line of dialogue, a sigil glimpsed, a tower half-remembered, the name spoken in dreams. Its psychological power lies precisely in its incompleteness, its capacity to haunt interpretive space without ever filling it. And this may be its most philosophical gift. Carcosa teaches us that what is most terrifying is not the void, but the near reality. The idea that the world almost makes sense, but not quite. That we are one symbol short of coherence, one mask shy of revelation, one reading too deep. Where does that leave us? Perhaps it leaves us here, at the end of a myth we cannot unthink, a city we cannot unsee, a silence we cannot unhear. Carcosa is not over. It never began. It is what remains when all else is forgotten. The trace, the echo, the sign. The yellow light beneath closed eyes, the black star behind memory. The city that waits for us, not in death, but in meaning's collapse. We were never meant to find Carcosa. We were meant to realize we are already there.